Dope. Um, that's what we needed. So I think yeah, intro's done. Let's just jump into it. So topic number one for today's podcast, and we tried to keep it a little mysterious in the teasers on the gram, just because one, we wanted to like not sell the whole farm before people jumped in.
What the
But
appetite?
yeah, but also like these are things that I don't think a lot of people know about. Um,
Hmm.
and maybe in the future we'll like tease it a little bit better. But the first thing we want to cover is for those of you who don't know, um, there has been some scuttlebuff around the scheduled talk for Robin DiAngelo, the author of White Fragility. She's scheduled
I
to
have my
talk
copy here somewhere.
at the University of Connecticut. I also have mine on my desk. Scheduled to talk at the University of Connecticut in November. And thanks to the Freedom of Information Act, a student at UConn acquired the
A graduate student,
invoice.
right,
A
Malter?
graduate student, correct? Acquired the invoice detailing what she was being compensated for her appearance, what it was going to be about, who was it for, all the important details. Um, the Freedom of Information Act allowed for that to be made public without it being some sort of big issue. And what we came to find out was that Robin DiAngelo is being invited to do a 3.5 hour talk. Okay, 3.5 hours on a workshop titled "Seeing the Racial Water." This is a kind of metaphor that she uses a lot in White Fragility to kind of help her audience navigate through the diversity and bias training that she engages in. And this talk is going to be invite only. Okay, so 3.5 hours, seeing the racial water, invite only. Already from
And
jump
and
is
Marcus,
sketchy.
correct me if I'm wrong. This was targeted at administrators, right? Or that because that I mean, obviously, I'm not privy to the politics at UConn, but that was my sense. Was that not only was invite only, but that it was centrally catering to like it sounded to me like a PD for admins.
Yes. It is
Okay.
it is targeted towards staff and administration, right? So it's not really being marketed to other people, which is why the only reason I heard about it is because it got FOIA'd. Otherwise, I would never have known that this happened. Um, I love BTC Daddy. Thank you for the follow. I don't know what that means, and I don't want to know. However, thank you for the follow.
Just let it rock.
Um,
Just let it rock.
right. So this talk that's targeted to the administration, come to find out, and again, this is public information. Y'all can Google it and it'll come up. You just type in Robin DiAngelo FOIA, and it's like the first search result. Look at this invoice. She is getting paid a whopping $20,000 for this speaking engagement. Okay, 20K for 3.5 hours of work, plus a $2,000 travel stipend. So that's $22,000 to come to Connecticut, talk for 3.5 hours, a talk that is rooted in her book, which is targeted towards a white audience, to discuss quote unquote white fragility and seeing the racial water. Right? Now, why would we want to talk about this? Well, at the risk of putting myself in a little bit of hot water, I attend the University of Connecticut. So it's a little bit of a hot button issue, and knowing that another grad student is the one who broke the story um, was pretty interesting to me. But what's really kind of off putting about it, which was summed up really nicely by Johnny Williams, who is a sociologist, and I'm going to quote him directly. He said the commodifying supposed remedies for white supremacy are always a racket. Students of black liberation easily recognize that the white fragility and anti-racist discourse are rehashing the same conceptual and racist um, errors it claims to be calling attention to, right? And that is where I think that Reese and I, when I brought this news to him, found the issue, right?
Yeah.
That there's been all of this hubbub in the wake of the murder of George Floyd about being anti-racist and getting educated. Finally, all of a sudden, it was like, yo, I gotta read a book. I gotta learn some stuff, right? What
Mhm.
is this information that I learned from a TV show about a massacre in Tulsa? Somebody hooked me up with some information. Right now, all of a sudden, we're concerned with learning, but you got this white woman coming into the academic spaces to target a white audience predominantly and try to get them to understand their racial bias. Right now, before I let you Reese just go in on this, just my own personal problem with it is that I'm doing this work every day in the classroom, all the time, right? Like it is my job as a sociologist and as an intro to soc teacher, right? I'm the first line of defense for this field of study for my kids. They're taking intro with me. I've been teaching it for the last 2 years, and I'm the one who has to be like, listen, society is messed up, and it's messed up in all these ways. All these inequities are historically built into our country and into the world at large,
Mhm.
right? But ain't nobody paying me 20 grand for 1 week's worth of hard academic labor. You gotta wonder, like, where's the disconnect? I
Yeah.
don't know.
Marcus, I appreciate the sort of framing of a lot of these issues, especially given this is, I mean, this touches your experience directly. Um, I mean, I look at these numbers. I remember you sent me the text or the tweet, and I had like I closed Safari and opened it again because the number was just so fucking ridiculous. I mean, it was outlandish to me. The amount of money that was getting paid, and as a graduate, I mean, I'm fortunate in that I'm ABD and I have full time employment, and I am making more money now um, than I ever did as a graduate student, and 25,000 a year was the most I ever made as a graduate student. Taking a full, graduate load, uh, teaching at the same time. Um, and that was on a fellowship year. So I was fortunate that I didn't get Uncle Sam didn't take his bite. And then every year thereafter, I mean, it was a pittance,
Yep.
and graduate and mind you, for folks who aren't privy to adjunct labor or to graduate labor at universities, 25 grand is a lot for us. There were at SU, I was fortunate to be part of the Maxwell School where graduate students are more handsomely compensated. But there were graduate students in other departments who were making a lot less, just significantly less. Um, living off of public housing, um, uh, needing food stamps to keep their bellies full. And I remember, SU in this really slime way unilaterally moved us off of like the cushy faculty health insurance plan onto the shiesty student plan. And that summer, when I wasn't teaching, um, and I was living off of this like tiny little stipend from my department, I had to literally make the choice between paying rent for the summer and having like the smallest bit to feed myself, or paying off my insurance because our new insurance plan required that the whole plan be paid for the year up front. And so those were my options, right? I can pay rent for for the summer and feed myself, or I could have access to healthcare. Um, those were my choices as a graduate student. And so to see Robin DiAngelo coming in to do less than 4 hours worth of work for 22 grand was like flabbergasting to me. Um, because if places like UConn and SU just like vacated, like if graduate students just stop teaching, these schools fall apart. They cease to function. Um, and so it was mind blowing to me. Now I want to be clear. I don't know Robin. I'm uh, uh, I know that she travels in some like scholarly circles that I'm sort of on the outskirts of, and she's um, if not like friends with, at very least collegial with some of my mentors, and I've heard nothing but good things. And I like the book, right? Like I don't take umbrage with the book. I don't take umbrage with what DiAngelo has to say. But I think DiAngelo doing this work raises all kinds of questions. Um, Not the least of which is like, what is the role of white folks here? Um, I but before all this came to a head, and I think I shared this with you, Mothman. There was um, as folks were really starting to grapple with the magnitude and the gravitas of George Floyd's death and the protests that were starting to catalyze. This is obviously early in the summer. CNN brought on Tim Wise, and Tim Wise is a sort of an anti-racist author, cultural critic, activist. I wouldn't call him a scholar, though. I wouldn't call him a scholar at the risk of sounding super bougie, because homeboy has no credentials. He's got a BA, I think, in political science. Can't remember where he got it from. And he's sharing the panel with Michael Eric Dyson.
Mm.
And I'm sitting here like, what the fuck? How are these two individuals comparable to each other?
Yep.
You know, and this isn't to detract from Tim Wise or Robin DiAngelo, right? Like, I think that there is important space and work for white scholars and educators, but I'm sitting here thinking Michael Eric Dyson is incredibly well published, is an accomplished scholar, and Tim Wise's claim to fame, at the risk of being really reductivist and dismissive, and he admits this, right? He's admitted this before, is like recycling the ideas of scholars of color so that they are more palatable to white audiences. Is that important? Yes, I feel like that is important. Because whether we like it or not, we live in a place right now where we're in a moment where anti-racist ideas simply sound more palatable, digestible when being delivered to a white audience by a white speaker.
Yeah.
But then the question then becomes, and this is where, you know, especially, I don't know what Tim Wise makes a year. I don't know any of his figures, but I know this 22 grand. What makes me bristle is this question of, so Robin DiAngelo is engaging in anti-racist work, right? And I think that she is acting in good faith. I want to be clear. Like, I'm not calling Robin DiAngelo a racist, but she's making 22 grand precisely because anti-racist ideas sound more palatable than when they come from a white person, from a white speaker. So is she not capitalizing on the very system that she's claiming to critique? And that's the part that I'm just like, ugh, that's fucked. It's like, and there's, I just struggle to wrap my mind around it.
That's the part that chaps my ass, because she says that in her own book. I literally highlighted it. It's in like the intro before she even gets started, and she returns to that point over and over again. And like, I also want to be clear that I'm not trying to knock her. I have no ill will towards her. I don't know her, so I can't really judge. I think my advisor has some opinions about her, but you know, that's a whole nother issue. Right, but like, what it is that she recognizes that there's something problematic about it, and yet like still dabbles in the work. And I think there's this dope article in the Washington Free Beacon called "The Wages of Woke" that like alludes to the fact that this is a profitable business, and people know that it's profitable, right? That like, even she is making the case like, you have to consume this content from me so that you can feel better about it, because getting it from somebody else is going to make you uncomfortable. And that's the part that bothers me, right? It's not that she's getting paid to do the work. Like, people should get paid to do the work, right? Somebody's got to get paid to do the work. My problem, and where it like rubs me the wrong way because it's so close to home, is like, I have to do that work. No one's giving me extra compensation to challenge, especially my white students, on these issues. And I've gotten pushback in the past. I've gotten kids that are upset with me about things that I say, right? Whether or not they agree with the facts that I root my lessons in. You know, and you know this. You've seen me teach before. You've seen what my teaching looks like. You know, I take it very seriously, and I make sure that every argument I make is grounded both in research, in fact, and relatable to the experiences of my students, right? Because no kid is going to consume any information that doesn't matter to them. And so when you break it down to their life, and you're like, this is the way that whiteness operates on a day-to-day basis, and this is how you got to challenge it. There are sometimes kids who are like, nope, that teacher sucks because, you know, he doesn't agree with me. I had a student in this summer session write a paper.
The one that I sat in on?
Yeah, write a paper.
Oh, shit.
In which they asked for comments, did not take any of the comments that I gave them, which was a whole other issue, right? But in the paper, they're like, I've had a lot of run-ins with teachers who treat me differently because they don't agree with my political ideals, right? They're like, I believe in a strong...
And this was a student of color, right? Marcus?
Yes, the student
Okay.
is Asian American, and
Okay.
the student was like, "Listen, I believe in a strong national border and this, that, and the third thing." And I'm like, "Okay." So the questions I asked to not be poking the bear and be like, "Oh, so you're a privileged white kid, um, or identify as a privileged white kid and don't realize it." I was like, "Listen, why do you think you've internalized those ideals? Why do you think those are valuable? How are you socialized to believe that these things are what you should be advocating for on a political level?" Did not respond to it at all, right? But that's my job. I have to poke and say like, "Hey, like, can you
Yeah.
think critically about why you think this way?" And that to me seems like more important work that gets done over the course of an entire semester
Yeah.
than a 3.5 hour workshop that, according to this article and according to a bunch of surveys taken from people who've been to these bias trainings, which there are many, and diversity
It's a whole.
and
I mean, it's a
inclusion,
cottage industry.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
and
yeah, for sure.
like a lot of them say they're not effective, right? That no one
Right.
changes their tune.
And it's not just that they're not. It's not simply that they're not effective. It's that we have never, in any meaningful way, bothered. It's an industry in and of itself, and we have never bothered to empirically measure the effectiveness of these trainings, of these institute. Right, like we build all of these things, and it becomes really performative. Right, which is part of, I think, the a part of the emerging critiques in the wake of the death of George Floyd is like all of this shit is song and dance. Um, and you're right, Marcus. Like there is no there are no metrics, right? There are no numbers or figures or just nothing that we can say, hey, having brought Robin DiAngelo netted us
Mm-hmm.
this change in our campus culture. And like I to be clear, I think we get ourselves into pernicious waters when we want to like attach numerical values to anti-racism, in some regards, right?
Yep.
Like there are other things that I think are concretely measured in numbers. um, but I think there's something to be said about being on the front lines of the belly of the beast, and that's what teachers do.
Yep.
You know what I'm saying? Like that is in fact what teachers do. And um and I just I struggle to see how I just struggle to see what this brings, and what this then nets students of color on campus at places like UConn.
Mm-hmm.
And I know we're talking about UConn because that's where Robin's speaking, but this is everywhere, right? Like, and at the school I work at, we have strategic relationships with um with folks who do the like diversity training and bias and equity training, and it's not to be dismissive, but I think the question should always be like, how has this changed the material realities of students of color? And I am failing to see how paying 22 racks to D'Angelo brings brings a meaningful change to our homegirl from your class.
Oh, it doesn't. It doesn't. And quick shout out, Ace. What up? I see you in the chat. Uh,
Oh, what up?
right, like the student who broke it in the tweet where he's like, "Listen, I got this thing, and these are the facts." Right? He got told by his own department that when his fellowship funding got cut, right? He's like, "Yo, I'm living out of my car. I'm showering at truck stops. Like, this is what I'm doing to get to work and still teach my classes." That student was told by the department that he should use the rec center to shower. The rec center he can't
That's
afford
smart.
to go into because he can't pay his university fee, right?
Mhm.
Like, as you said, like I don't get paid over the summer, right? My salary is a 10-month salary, 9.5, right? Like, I don't get paid over the summer, so I'm expected to save what I make
Mhm.
to live for those 3 months,
Right.
right? And then get my next paycheck. But if you have an academic who, or a former academic who's now an author, getting paid what I make in a year, less than a year, right? Like, how does that math?
Mhm.
How does that work out? And then
Mhm.
you made the point that I think was really really important about how she's taking a lot of, and a lot of, not just her, a lot of the scholars who are doing this work and need to be doing this work in some capacity are the taking the work of other scholars like Ta-Nehisi Coates and Dyson and Fagan and a bunch of like really great scholars that we love and read because we have to, or we choose to also, right? Taking it and parsing it
Fagan's the
down
homie.
into like nuggets of truth that feel more palatable. And you got to ask, like, why not just go to them, right? And I saw Sarah's comment, right, about like saying pick a different book because these are the issues. But in that Wages of Woke article, right, they allude to some of her, I'm not gonna say competition, but like some of the other status symbols in the industry of anti-racism, right? And so it was said that Ibram X. Kendi, who I actually saw speak here at the Coast Guard, where I live, he brings in about 25K for an hour-long talk. And How to Be an Anti-Racist and Stand from the Beginning are books that have picked up in sales a lot.
And
then
I gotta say though,
yeah,
Marcus, because and I think one of the things that's happened is in a moment where we call into question like the legitimacy and the politics of like reading a book like White Fragility or bringing in a scholar like Robin DiAngelo. I think we then default to somebody like Kendi, but I gotta be honest. I thought that How to Be an Anti-Racist was a total fucking cash grab. It is, and I don't know if you've read it, and I would love
I haven't yet.
to
It's in the house.
It just I got through it and I was so disappointed because it is so radically different than Stamped. Stamped is like this. I mean, it's a tome, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's just so well researched and well put together. And How to Be an Anti-Racist felt fucking cheap because it felt like an effort to make a grab at the emerging cottage industry in the wake of all this shit, and it feels fucked up. But we have to be frank. I think Kendi gets more legitimacy precisely because he's a scholar of color, right? We don't question those pieces. But How to Be an Anti-Racist was a fucking cash grab.
Yeah, and so like,
Straight up.
so thinking about that, right? Like, and it's interesting because like you said, we make less questioning about the scholars of color, but we also had Anthony Jack come speak um, last in the fall, and I've seen Anthony Jack speak twice now. And he came once to my own graduate seminar on a little more informal basis and was really upfront and was like, listen, I couldn't afford my own graduation doctoral robe. I had to go out and give a talk, get paid, and then buy it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm sitting here thinking like The Privileged Poor, which I think you like recently picked up, right? I've read it
It's
twice
literally
now.
right here.
Have you read it yet?
No.
So it is.
It's like fifth in the docket. Not gonna lie.
It is dope, and one of the things I like about it a lot. It's a great book. 10 out of 10 would recommend that people read it.
Copy.
Tony is awesome. The book is great, and one of the things that I think you will appreciate about it, that I appreciate about it, is as a prep kid, and I believe you were an Oliver kid, right?
Yeah.
Right, like that's what he's talking about, and like the first couple pages, I was like, oh shit, this was my exact academic experience. I went from prep to ABC, and like I know exactly what he's talking about, and even if you don't, like a lot of people have been to schools where those kids exist, and it opens up this box in your head where you're like, oh crap, that's what they were dealing with, right? Like, and something we've talked about in our own experiences for a long time is how like we've been better acquainted with the navigation of like historically white spaces because of those programs that put us into those educational spaces early on, right? Like from jump, you start to learn how different it is from what you've been accustomed to, figuring out how to deal in that space and like advocate for yourself in spaces where like you would never have been taught to advocate for yourself otherwise.
And I've long maintained that I think the I mean, don't get me wrong, like Oliver prepped me really well to be at Westtown, and I felt like I found my pace eventually. I think I'm remembered more fondly than I was. Like I was not an A student my first semester here, but I think that more than anything, the value in programs like prep and ABC and in my case Oliver is the cultural education, how to move through white space. Straight up, that was way more important and valuable to me when I got to prep school than any of the shit about composition that I learned.
Mm-hmm.
Straight up.
1000%. Yeah, that's exactly how I feel about it, and it's why like reading a book like that or God, what is I can't even think of the name of the book now, which makes me feel really bad. If I looked at my race and education syllabus, I'd remember. But like, I read a book about education inequality in Chicago and the closing of schools. Read books about assimilation in graduate school and law school. Read all kinds of stuff, and I'm like, those are the texts you need to be reading, like realistically. But like you mentioned, they're hard for people to tackle. I remember I was reading. We were 8 years in Power on vacation with my family, and my dad was like, I would like, recite some tidbits to him every time something really interesting came up because my dad's interested in that kind of stuff, and he'd be like, "Oh, but do you know like what he's referencing?" I'm like, "Yeah, I've read all the texts that are coming
Mhm.
up in this. Like, I know all of
Right.
them." So whenever
Right.
something gets referenced that's deeply sociological or philosophical or anthropological that has meshed in some sort of social science that I've been a part of, right? Like, I know all of the conversations around this thing, and so when it gets
Mhm.
put into like, which that text is like a collection of Atlantic articles that
That's
Tom
right. Yeah.
Massey
Yeah.
wrote, and then he like gives them basically like spark notes, like like liner
Yeah.
notes. I'm like, it makes the palatable version gets that much more interesting when you read his explanations and all the detail and you know what's going on in
Yeah.
there. But like that is not what is being expected of people who are coming to give these invited talks and kind of like do the diversity and inclusion checkbox, right? And something that my father-in-law like mentioned last weekend, which I thought was really interesting. He's like, I bet you money that she was invited by an alumnus.
Oh, for
That an
sure.
alumnus is footing that bill. And I'm like, oh, you like that would make so much more sense to me because
Mhm.
I think I told you this, but the provost has open office hours, and during that he basically came out and was like, I don't even know who requested that she come to speak. And
Hmm.
knowing that, I'm like, it's got to be some alumnus who's like, you know what, I'm gonna do my part. This is gonna be how I contribute to the conversation.
Yeah. And I think Marcus, when you bring up we were 8 years in power and how different your read and
Hey,
your
other
dad's
Reese with the swoop. Ghost in the Schoolyard was the book I was thinking of. Thanks, bro.
Ghost
Eve
that
Ewing,
great
Ghost in the Schoolyard.
great book, great book. Shout out to Reese, for that clutch plug-in. I think Marcus, one of the pieces that you're highlighting when you're elucidating your read of we were 8 years in power from your dad's is I think that one of the challenges is that, and I think that that's part of the brilliance of this book is that if you have never read fucking shit, D'Angelo's a great primer. And I think that in that regard, books like this are gold, right? Because when you bring the horse to water, you got to give them something, right? Like you can't tell somebody, yeah, you know what? You got to read Souls of Black Folk, and then you got to read Racist America, and then you got to read Black. What? It's overwhelming. It's inundating. It's alienating. And then it also, right? Like we were just saying earlier, we're not trying to be bougie. You don't need a PhD to enjoy this shit, but that's the challenge, right? And so I think part of the wall that schools are running into is that we just keep shit at the fucking intro level. We keep things at the JVC level to make a like a prep school sports reference. And I think that that's part of the challenge. I think that white fragility should level you up into more complex conversations so that you get the other reference points. But what happens is that inviting Robin DiAngelo to speak for 4 hours, mostly to admins for 22 racks, does not build that. You need to build that institutional architecture. You need to build the institutional culture that then scaffolds educators themselves so that they can get, just build a repertoire, build facility with these texts so that we're not stuck fucking like reinventing the wheel and having really low level conversations that are so introductory as to not be catalytic to bigger changes. And I think that's the challenge. And I think the big question that we've actually left totally unanswered, and I think given time and what's on our docket, we can't entertain, but I think it's worth naming that this remains a question is we haven't, like, if we're saying that Robin under these circumstances ain't it, what then is the place for the D'Angelos, right? Because I think the text is good, right? I think if you have never read anything in critical whiteness studies or critical race theory, and I give this to somebody, I have great confidence that this will be generative. But what then do we say, right? Do we say that, well, anti-racist work is only for people of color? No, that's not what we want,
Yep.
right? I don't know that anybody's advocating for that. And the reality is, I, bro, I've been a broke ass college student. I've been a broke ass graduate student. And I'm not saying that Robin DiAngelo's broke, but I'm not trying to take food off of Robin's plate,
Well, she's not
right?
broke.
No, 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 most definitely, right? But what I'm saying is, are we then saying that anti-racist white scholars and educators can't build career, right? Like I don't know that that's the solution either. And I've had this conversation with other Marcus Bell, who's a member of of my cohort. He's now a professor. Um, well, he was a professor at OCC. He just got a new gig. Um, but Marcus says, nah, bro, like we need Wise. We need Tim Wise. Hate it or love it, Tim Wise is central to the quest for undoing racism. And so, but I think like the question is what are like the ethics and politics of that work. I've had thankfully amazing white colleagues and white coworkers and white co-conspirators who I've done super dope work with in these. I mean, one of the first people that comes to mind is Mary Canito Colville. You know, she yeah, like my Trayvon Martin work gets labeled as like my work, but the first publication was co-authored with
Mm.
Mary and Dalia Rodriguez, and I mean Mary is white. You know what I'm saying? As white as the day is long, and also like an amazing educator, an amazing researcher, and somebody whose whole career really revolves around issues of justice and inequity. I'm not trying to say that Mary doesn't have a place,
Yeah.
right? And I'm not trying to say that Mary can't publish or build a career on this, but I think that we've left unanswered that broader question, and but I don't know that we're gonna do that shit in 20 minutes.
No, no, we're not. And I think this is the last thing I'll say about it. And I think that one of the places that we can go, or one of the hopes that I have, and it seems like a easy fix, but it's definitely not. And it may just be my experience, right? But take a social class. The fact that that's not mandatory is infuriating. And I say this because a lot of my students, as the instructor of the writing version of Introduction to Sociology, which for anyone who's been to a college knows that one of your requirements is to take a freaking writing course to prove that you can write an essay. And at my school, most of the kids take Soc because they feel like it's the best place to get that writing credit. And while that's great, I don't get a lot of social scientists. I get a lot of engineers and business students and, students of the other flavors of academia. And that being their first exposure to social science is always just like mystifying. Some take a lot more from it than others, but the ones that have like really taken something from it, when I hear from them after the semester, during the semester even, like when they're just like, oh shit, like I didn't think about that. I had no idea this was a thing. Can you tell me more? I had a student all summer when protests started and there were like real national level discussions being had, who was just emailing me on the regular like, I have questions. I do not know who to listen to, where to get reference from, right? Like I only know about these things because we talked about them in class, and now they've come to the forefront, and I can't ignore them. So how can I be better educated about this? And I'm like, if you hadn't taken the class, would you even care? Right? Like that's not to pat myself on the back and be like, oh, I did a great job, but I'm saying like, would students be informed if they didn't have that like intro level discussion? That happens too late, right? Like the reinvented the wheel opinion isn't wrong because they have to unlearn a lot of stuff in a class like that. Where I'm like, by the way, your conception of a lot of things in life are wrong, and I hate being the one to have to be like, it's actually incorrect, right? Because that throws a lot of people the wrong way to be told that what they know isn't true, and they have to unlearn things. Um, but that is a lot of the process that ends up happening, right? Because education isn't standardized, and we have whole different conceptions of history in a lot of parts of the country, and all these other issues where you take a grad student in an intro to social class who's like, by the way, reality is thus, right? Like when you sit a kid down and make them read the civil rights, the Declarations of the South of the Confederacy, right? And they have to read the fact that one of the stipulations was that we want to keep slavery. They're like, whoa, nobody told me that. I'm like, it's written right there. It's in your history. You just didn't know.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the problem. We're literally just undoing a lot of nonsense, and that undoing work, I agree with you 1,000%, has to also be done by white academics. It has to be done in ways that are available to other people. But like, we gotta find a solution that comes with the next step after that.
And I think that what you're pointing towards is that this shit happens in the fucking trenches.
Yeah.
It happens in the messiness, in the visceral messiness of the classroom, and the sort of the wake of those classroom experiences. I think some of my most precious relationships with students have been those who've had that like torn asunder experience. Um, that's facilitated in a classroom that isn't catalyzed buy a bougie ass fucking 20 grand talk. I think institutions need to recognize that the wiser investment, frankly, isn't in bringing Robin DiAngelo. It's in paying your fucking graduate students.
I'm gonna leave it at that. Let's move on to the next topic because I want to get through the other two things, and we're already neck deep in this. And I
This
know
episode's gonna be long.